When did you last cancel plans, not out of exhaustion, but out of something closer to relief? Think about the invitation you saw on your phone, and let it sit unanswered for 2 days, hoping it would simply expire on its own. Think about the dinner party, where you spent the whole night nodding along to a conversation you'd already had a dozen times, watching the clock, waiting for a polite exit. Think about the relationship where you loved the person and still felt the specific fatigue of performing yourself for hours at a stretch. And the quiet flood of relief the second you were finally alone again. You have felt this before. You noticed it, and then you punished yourself for it. You called it antisocial. You called it cold. You wondered, quietly, if something in you was broken, because everyone around you seemed crave company, the way you craved silence. There is a gap between what you're supposed to want and what you actually want. Most people live inside that gap without ever naming it. It shows up as a low hum of guilt, a restlessness whenever you turn down an invitation, a feeling with no clean name, somewhere between shame and dread, that sits in your chest each time you choose the empty room over the crowded one. Arthur Schopenhauer, in 1851, writing in Parerga and Paralipomena, described a state he called intellectual solitude, the natural condition of a mind carrying too much inner wealth to tolerate constant external noise. A rich inner world in his framing doesn't need to be filled from outside. It needs quiet, the way a full container needs a lid, not more pouring in. This is worse than simple introversion. It is not that you dislike people. Plenty of people you dislike have nothing to do with this. This is quieter and stranger than that. Not misanthropy, not shyness, not coldness. Intellectual solitude, the specific ache of a mind that has already generated more than a room can absorb, and finds itself depleted rather than fed by company. This video is going to show you the mechanism Schopenhauer discovered why certain minds experience solitude as nourishment rather than deprivation, why this has nothing to do with social skill, and what to do once you finally stop treating it as a flaw to be corrected. Here is the reversal that should unsettle you a little. The people who feel guiltiest about preferring solitude are very often the ones with the richest inner lives to protect. The more company exhausts you, the more evidence it is that something inside you is already full by the end of this video. You won't need anyone's permission to protect that fullness. You'll already understand why it was never a defect to begin with. You think of yourself as antisocial. Schopenhauer would tell you that you are simply self-sufficient in the world as will and representation. Published in 1818, Schopenhauer argued that human suffering largely stems from unmet want, and that the mind with the fewest unmet wants is the mind most capable of peace. Most people seek company because their own thoughts, left alone, are unbearable to sit with. Solitude, for them, functions like a withdrawal, an emptiness demanding to be filled. For a mind with sufficient internal resources, the same solitude functions the opposite way, like a muscle finally allowed to rest after being asked to perform in front of an audience all day. Watch for 4 symptoms, because they are the visible edge of an invisible current. You feel a specific targeted fatigue after socializing, not sadness, not boredom, but a depletion, as if something measurable has been spent. Second, you find yourself prescripting small talk in your head before it happens, running through the version of yourself you'll need to perform. Third, you notice your best thinking, your clearest insights arrive almost exclusively in solitude, in the shower, on a walk, alone, in the quiet hour before anyone else wakes up. Fourth, you feel a disproportionate relief at canceled plans, a relief that embarrasses you slightly, because you know you're supposed to feel disappointment. Instead, Schopenhauer's broader claim was that the value a person places on solitude is a fairly precise measure of the value of what's happening inside their own head. Company is compensation. If your inner world already pays out, you need less external income. There is a second, hidden cost buried inside this dynamic. Every time you override this preference, forcing yourself into unwanted company out of guilt, obligation, or fear of seeming strange, you don't just lose the hours spent. You teach yourself that your own instinct about your own needs are unreliable. This compounds. The next time solitude calls, you trust the call a little less, because you've spent months overriding it in favor of what you assumed you were supposed to want. Here is a self-audit. Think of a decision you made recently to attend something you didn't want to attend. Ask yourself honestly, was that decision made from genuine desire or from the fear of what your absence would seem to say about you? Most people run through this exercise for the first time, are surprised by how rarely the honest answer is desire. Individually, each obligation is small enough to justify, counted together across a single, ordinary month. The pattern of override is no longer subtle. It's simply been accumulating in installments too small to notice as a single, undeniable cost. There is a healthy version of this preference and a destructive one. The healthy version notices the pull toward solitude and honors it without needing to justify it to anyone. The destructive version curdles into total avoidance, using solitude as a wall against all connection rather than a genuine restorative. Here is the one-line diagnostic. If solitude leaves you replenished and still capable of choosing company when it matters, if it leaves you unable to tolerate company at all, it's no longer solitude, it's isolation wearing solitude's name. The next part examines why this preference feels less like a decision and more like something you've been quietly ashamed of for no good reason. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Intellectual solitude doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a deficiency you're supposed to apologize for. Schopenhauer, in his essays on the wisdom of life, argued that most people mistake constant sociability for health, when it is often the opposite, an inability to tolerate one's own company mistaken for warmth. Treating your preference for solitude as a problem to be fixed is not a neutral act. It is itself a bet, a quiet, standing claim that the crowd's definition of a well-lived life applies to you specifically, regardless of what your own mind actually requires to function well. The structure that keeps this shame alive is almost elegant in its design. It's unfalsifiable by construction. Every good, restorative hour spent alone gets reinterpreted as a symptom rather than evidence. So no amount of positive experience can ever count as proof you're doing something right. And the threshold for enough socializing keeps moving. Today, it's just show up to this one thing. And once you've shown up, the goalposts shift toward staying longer, engaging more, wanting it more visibly. The preference is never actually tested on its own terms. It is only ever managed and apologized for. Here is a practical diagnostic. Go back to the last time you forced yourself into company against your own instinct in a comparable situation. What actually happened? Did you come away energized, or did you come away more depleted than if you'd simply stayed home and done the thing that actually restores you? Most people run through this exercise honestly. Find the pattern holds every time. Forced sociability doesn't produce the connection it promises. It produces the same fatigue on a longer delay. The first real exit from intellectual solitudes disguised as a flaw is not confidence, and it is not a permission slip you need from anyone else. It is simply seeing the shame for what it is, a belief you inherited, not a fact you discovered. Notice how the belief recruits allies. It borrows the language of care, so declining an invitation feels like rejecting a person rather than protecting a resource. It borrows the language of growth, so that solitude gets rebranded as avoidance you need to work on. This is what makes it so durable, a belief that announced itself honestly. I am uncomfortable with your solitude because it excludes me would be easy to see clearly. A belief dressed as concern for your well-being is not. There's a reason this particular disguise works so well on capable, self-aware people specifically. Schopenhauer noted that the mind sharp enough to see through most illusions is often the same mind least suspicious of the ones dressed as virtue. You would catch a lazy excuse instantly. A belief that arrives wearing the language of kindness and connection slips past the same scrutiny that would flag anything else. Think of this as a ledger. On one side, the cost of honoring your own need for solitude, a brief, finite discomfort, an awkward decline, a friend's mild disappointment that passes within a day. On the other side, the cost of constantly overriding that need, diffuse, invisible, and compounding. Charged to you in small installments you barely notice you're paying. Give that invisible cost some texture. It's the 2 hours after a gathering you didn't want to attend, spent staring at a wall, too depleted to do the work, or the reading, or the thinking you actually wanted to do that day. It's the sharper, shorter temper you carry into the next morning because your reserves were spent on people instead of restored by silence. It's the specific quality of insight you never had, the idea that never fully formed because the quiet hour it needed was traded away for an obligation you didn't actually want to keep. Wrote about the erosion of what he called inner wealth, the idea that a mind constantly emptied outward, never given time to replenish itself, gradually loses its capacity for the very depth that made solitude valuable in the first place. Every hour spent performing sociability you didn't choose pulls resources from the hours where your mind would otherwise be doing its best, most original work. It shows up in places that have nothing to do with the original gathering, a harder time concentrating the next day, a shorter fuse in conversations that used to feel easy, a low-grade fatigue that doesn't trace back to any single cause because it isn't coming from one dot. Here is the inversion. Stated plainly, the cost of simply declining, of protecting the solitude your mind is actually asking for, is cheaper than what you are already paying to avoid the discomfort of declining. Run that backward through your own history. How long have you actually known that certain kinds of company drain you more than they give back? A year, longer. Multiply that stretch of time by the small daily tax of overriding it anyway, and the total cost dwarfs the one-time discomfort of simply saying no. There's a consistent pattern among people who finally start protecting their solitude on purpose. The cost was real. A few awkward conversations, a friend or two who took it personally at first, but it was almost always smaller than expected, because the anticipation itself had been doing most of the damage. The tax was never really the declining. The tax was the years spent dreading the moment of having to. Here is the closing idea for this chapter, and it will come back later. Clarity is not what precedes protecting your solitude. Clarity is what protecting it produces. Schopenhauer drew a distinction that applies directly here, between problems that dissolve the moment you have enough reassurance, and problems that don't move, no matter how much reassurance you gather. Call this second category, for our purposes, social debt anxiety, the specific fear that declining company will cost you the relationship entirely. A fear that no amount of external reassurance seems able to fix on its own. The mechanism behind social debt anxiety is an amplification loop. A decline you haven't yet made doesn't sit still in your head. It generates competing images, worst case, narratives about what your absence will mean to the people who notice it. And those images get more vivid, not less, the longer you sit with them without ever testing them. Against reality, you imagine that declining the invitation will be read as rejection. And the longer you sit with that story, the more certain the imagined hurt feelings become, until you can practically hear the disappointed tone of a conversation that hasn't happened yet. You imagine that if you protect your solitude too consistently, people will eventually stop asking altogether. And the longer you sit with that fear, the more total and permanent the imagined isolation becomes. You imagine that explaining your need for solitude out loud will sound like an excuse, or worse, an insult, and the longer you rehearse that scenario, the more cartoonishly wounded your imagined audience gets. Here is the counterintuitive finding. More time spent worrying does not produce more readiness to decline gracefully. It produces a more elaborate fear of declining at all. The version of the conversation you're avoiding gets worse in your head every week you postpone having it. Not because the actual people in your life are getting more fragile, but because your unchecked imagination has nothing else to do with the time. The exit here is mechanical, not psychological. Act at the first real opportunity, the next invitation that arrives when you already know, honestly, that you'd rather be alone, not at the point where you finally feel ready to explain yourself perfectly, because that point does not arrive on its own. Readiness, it turns out, is retrospective. It is not a precondition for declining. It is a byproduct that shows up after you've already declined once and survived it. Describing what just happened rather than permitting it in advance. This is worth sitting with. because it inverts almost everything you've been telling yourself about the order of operations. You've assumed the sequence runs: gather more reassurance, feel confident, then finally allow yourself to say no. Schopenhauer's model of this kind of difficulty runs the other way. The reassurance was never going to arrive from outside, because the fear was never actually about the other person's reaction. It was about untested imagination running unchecked. One real instance of declining and watching the relationship survive intact does more to dissolve social debt, anxiety, than another year of gathering more of the same reassurance you've already been unable to fully believe. Here's a metaphor worth correcting. You've probably been picturing the choice to protect your solitude as a door, something you walk through once, into a permanently simpler social life. That's the wrong image. The right one is a different version of the self, built the same way any trained capacity is built, through repetition, not through a single threshold crossing. Schopenhauer described character not as something that changes through argument or insight alone, but as a pattern that reveals and reinforces itself through repeated choices, closer to a groove worn into shape. Through use, than a fact discovered once and then simply known. This matters here because it means the ability to protect your solitude without guilt isn't something you either have or don't. It's something you build, one instance at a time. There's a behavioral principle underneath this: resolutions that stay purely internal thoughts, intentions, private permission you've quietly given yourself, produce essentially no lasting change on their own. Only enacted resolutions, ones that touch actual behavior in the world, reorganize anything. You can decide privately 100 times that your solitude is valid, and nothing will shift until that decision shows up the next time an invitation arrives and you actually say no. So here is one concrete instruction, doable in the next 24 hours. The next time an invitation arrives that you feel the familiar pull to decline it simply and without over-explaining. Do not build an elaborate justification. Say, "I can't make it, but thank you for thinking of me." And let the sentence stand without padding it with apology. Act at the first real opportunity, not the best one. This matters because delay doesn't just cost you time, it lets the old guilt reorganize. The version of you that over-explains and then attends anyway gets stronger every time it succeeds, and weaker every time it doesn't. The first available moment is always the cheapest one to act in, because the guilt hasn't had time to regroup. This is not a one-time fix. It's a repeated, small transaction. The same way any trained capacity is built, not by one difficult decline, but by a pattern of ordinary ones performed consistently. The first time you decline cleanly, without over-explaining, it will feel exposed and slightly rude, even though it isn't. That's expected, not a sign you're doing it wrong. The 10th time, it will feel closer to neutral. By the 50th, protecting your own solitude will feel less like an act of defiance and more like an accurate description of how you already move through the world, the life where you fully inhabit your own solitude. Without guilt is not hidden from you. It's not buried somewhere you need to excavate. Something specific already surfaced while you were watching this, an invitation you're dreading. A relationship where you perform more than you rest. A version of your calendar you'd redesign completely if shame weren't involved. You know which one it is. Schopenhauer's larger point extends well past this single behavior. He argued that a certain kind of relentless sociability gets mistaken over and over for emotional health, that people confuse constant company with connection, and confuse discomfort with one's own mind for a personal failing, when often what's actually happening is a quieter form of avoidance, filling every hour with other people, specifically so there's no time left to sit with your own thoughts. The real problem was never the preference. You already know you think better alone, feel calmer alone, do your best work alone. The real problem is the gap between knowing that and letting yourself act on it without apology, the space where a true observation about your own nature sits unused, gathering interest on a debt you didn't need to owe anyone. Here's the chronic reframe. Delaying the decision to protect your solitude doesn't reduce the discomfort of eventually doing it. It only spreads that same discomfort out over a much longer stretch of time, taxing you in small amounts for years instead of once, briefly, now. Acute discomfort faced directly, one honest decline. One awkward conversation is almost always cheaper than the chronic version of the same discomfort, stretched thin across a lifetime of forced attendance. Courage, in this framing, is not something you need to locate before you protect your own quiet. Courage is a product of motion. It shows up after the first clean decline, not before it, the same way readiness does. Think back to the invitation, the relationship, the version of your calendar that came to mind earlier. Picture the next ordinary moment when solitude calls and company is expected instead. Picture yourself choosing the quiet room without narrating an apology for it. That single, small, undramatic choice is the entire mechanism this video has been describing. Not a revelation, not a breakthrough, just one instance followed by another, until the pattern that used to run automatically toward guilt starts running automatically toward peace instead. You know what you need to do. You know that you know. You know that the fatigue after every forced gathering has already told you more than once in more than one way. You know that the only thing left unresolved is whether you'll let yourself listen. Solitude was never the absence of a life.